So my question is to anyone here, what should the Weather Underground have done instead of what they did?
Organize a vanguard to organize the proletariat as a revolutionary class.
Rob, I mean, this is your
presentation. You want my opinion?
Sure.
If I were part of the Weather Underground and organizing it for myself, blow up a building a day. I would avoid killing people, but I mean, people don't pay attention to one bombing every other month. That's not going to get media attention. If that's what they were going for, you can't blow up 6 buildings a year and expect people to really look at that. I'd blow up a building a day.
Perhaps they did what they could. I mean, I've never been involved in an underground group organizing bombings of buildings that took civilian casualty into regard and was an attempt to not be bombed.
Well, I think definitely they did what they could. I think that was very specific, and what that indicates to me is they rushed into it.
So they didn't have numbers before.
Right, that they should have waited it out until they had the opportunity to carry out something that would have been effective rather than just kind of an impotent yelping at the U.S. government.
I think administratively it could be a failure in different ways. Like, for instance, there's no reason to dissolve the SDS. What happened is it seemed like there was a progression of the SDS, which had an organization of over 500,000 students around the country, you know, to be activated the same way that Kent State students were ready to be activated for like more public sort of displays, you know, like for instance at Kent State they burnt down an old National Guard building, if I'm not mistaken, you know, those sort of clear actions. But then in addition to that, this other thing makes it seem as if, well, first of all, you can't run a visible organization from an invisible organization. It can be in sort of like in Constitution with it, but I don't think it would be very practical to do that. So what you would do is you would just have it kind of, in essence, taking orders or, you know, the sort of ideology and moving forward with it, while the actual workers' movement, the one that is not terroristic, is moving forward. So you just do both. I don't know. Go ahead.
I agree with that. I think oftentimes there's, like in this club, there's a lot of talk about pragmatism, but then if a particular act against capitalism doesn't fall into someone's specific definition of what is revolutionary, it's referred to as reactionary. And I was having a debate with someone once who debated quite more skillfully than I did. I referred to actions that did not address capitalism as kind of the root of social injustice. I said that was not addressing that was not addressing the cause, like any other action was addressing the symptoms. And I think kind of if I understand what you're saying, is you don't have to just address the symptoms or just address the cause. You can address the cause and the symptoms at the same time.
Well, right, but I think, you know, all actions are incontinent that are only interested in just stomping out the symptoms. You have to get at the core. You know, it has to be essentially principled. The SDS, you know, I'm sure there were probably people in the Weather Underground that was all like, listen, there's basically, you have this sort of motion inside the SDS, it's not willing to go far enough, and it's not ideologically sound, and that's why we need to basically break with them and take whoever we can, and that's how many people we got. You know, a really good example of that is the Days of Rage in Chicago. Days of Rage in Chicago, they were literally advocating for students to show up. I mean, these 500,000 students across campus. And they were like flyering, they're like, listen, the Days of Rage are going to happen. Basically, part of the reason was that they were just going to basically destabilize the authority that the police have and the sort of moral right that the police have in Chicago. And keep in mind that it's Chicago in the 60s and all the racism and things like that was going on. And something like, out of the 500,000 students that are part of that, and on paper, right, but, you know, if it's even half of that actually goes to meetings and things like that, only something like a couple hundred people, like 250 people show up to Days of Rage. So, you know, when they make that break, you know, it's probably like, listen, we need to cut this thing off while it's rotting, or we'll lose even more people to this sort of ideological other, you know what I mean? And if you keep in mind, what was it that the SDS was into? I mean, I would advocate for an SDS that was ideologically sound, but basically, you know, it was economist, it was opportunist, you know, I mean, it's just a whole big variation of what's going on in the center there. So, you know, was the Weatherman right to do that? Yeah, I mean, obviously, historically, you know, the answer is no. But the question is, you know, what could they have done? You know.
But at the beginning of your statement, didn't you say not breaking from the SDS could have provided, you know, could have provided a different outcome? You know?
Well, this is what I'm saying is like, I'm just pointing out the historical example of them breaking with it, basically showed how many people are actually really principled enough in those particular, you know, thought of idea that violence was going to be necessary to do that, you know. So what I'm saying is, you know, to me, one of the big failures of the whole Vietnam thing is it was all selfish interest, right? It's all like, oh, we don't really care. Oh my gosh, they're going to draft me. Universal solidarity of everyone, you know. That's what Vietnam is, you know. For me, what all these people are, they're like, oh, we can do it peaceful, and well, who cares if capitalism isn't bad, just as long as it has a small dick when it's raping me and all this sort of thing, you know. If that's their story, then that's what they got. And that's why a lot of the Weather Underground, the support for the Weather Underground, dissolved after the war. Because a majority of people in the SDS, where are they now? I don't know, probably over there or over there, you know.
Teaching at universities.
Right, well, I mean, Weather Underground people teach at universities too now, but anyway.
To say, I guess, kind of like how, well, it just seems like in all these situations, it is really hard to get people, like say for in the United States, to make big sacrifices or to really do what's necessary, say, to stop the U.S. government from invading another country or, you know, killing a couple 100,000 people in another country. Just because people here just aren't affected by it that much. Again, it's kind of opportunist. I don't want to get drafted, so therefore, like, I'm against the Vietnam War. So it just seems like that's always the case, is that the people who are not really directly affected by things that much don't really make big sacrifices, whereas, say, for example, in Iraq, more recently, or in Palestine, or in Vietnam, obviously, in those places, the people made huge sacrifices to fight against the U.S. Like that we here in the United States just kind of couldn't even really imagine. Because even to me, what the Weather Underground people did seemed like a pretty huge sacrifice to, you know, bomb these buildings and go underground. And, you know, I mean, they did get let off in the end, but, you know, they could have been put in prison for 15, 20, 30, 40 years.
They definitely didn't expect to be let off the hook.
No.
That's what I mean. So there were some big consequences that they I'm sure thought were pretty likely for doing what they did. So it was like a pretty big sacrifice, it seems to me. But then again, when you compare that to the sacrifice of what the Viet Cong gave, or say insurgents in Iraq, or you know, as we talked about, members of the PFLP or Hamas that tried to fight against the Israelis. I mean, the sacrifice of, you know, the guys in the Weather Underground seems like pretty minuscule, and even more so the sacrifice of the people in the SDS who just wanted to stick with like nonviolent stuff seems like even more minuscule. So it just seems like, you know, wherever you go, it's like the people who are the victims of imperialism are the ones that at the end of the day are the ones who are going to really step up hard to resist it. And I guess, you know, this kind of ties in with the Marxist notion of, at the end of the day, if there's anyone that's going to liberate workers, it's the workers themselves, essentially. And that's kind of an unfortunate fact, but it just seems like that's largely the case. There's a pretty good book by Ward Churchill called The Pathology of Pacifism, which really critiques the idea that we here in the U.S., we're all about nonviolent this and nonviolent that, and going to vigils, and in reality, it's kind of just to make ourselves feel better, so that we can say, hey, we went out to the peace vigil, but we really don't want to make the sacrifices necessary to actually stop the war in Vietnam or stop the war in Iraq.